The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, we look at annexation threats, both old and new. Then, Nan Kiwanuka speaks to the mayor of the Nickel City about how Ontario's critical minerals can play a role in our trade war with the U.S. And finally, we revisit our conversation with actor Saul Rubinek about his remarkable play, Portraying Shylock, which is backed by popular demand on stage at Toronto's CAA Theatre this week. That's all ahead on the agenda. Believe it or not, Donald Trump is not the first person to want Canada to join the U.S. Calls to make our country part of theirs go back to well before Confederation, and the calls were even coming from inside the House. Joining us now to tell us what the annexation talks of yesterday can tell us about today, we welcome, in the nation's capital, Dominique Marshall, professor of Quebec and Canadian history at Carleton University, and with us here in studio, Adam Bunch, a historian and author whose work you can read on his Substack. It's called The Toronto Time Traveler. Adam, nice to have you here. Dominique Marshall, grand plaisir de... Well, I was going to try my French, but my French stinks. So why don't I just say it's not very lovely to welcome you to our program today. Adam, to you first. You wrote an article for your newsletter entitled The Annexation Manifesto of 1849. What prompted you to write the piece?
Well, you won't be surprised to learn it was recent news in headlines. There are all these moments in Canadian history that, stretch back to before Confederation, where annexation by the United States is sort of this recurring theme, and there are a bunch of big sort of flashpoints for it. One of the big ones is this Annexation Manifesto from the 1840s. So it felt like a thing to write about these days.
So for those who think this is the first time any of this has ever happened, that's a big NO on that.
Yeah, far from it.
Okay. Now, while this Annexation Manifesto was making its way through the population and popular discourse at the time, there was a counter-argument which Toronto Public Library has discovered. They're apparently in the archives of the City of Toronto. And Sheldon, bring this up, please. This is a copy of the document which is a countermeasure to the Annexation Manifesto, and it's I'll read a little bit of it here. It says, "We, the undersigned, inhabitants of the City of Toronto, having learned from the public press that a document has been circulated for signatures in and about the City of Montreal, advocating the annexation of Her Majesty's Province of Canada to a foreign state, our firm determination to resist all attempts at trifling with our allegiance, transferring us from the mild and just rule of our gracious sovereign to the United States of America or any other foreign power." This was courtesy of the Toronto Public Library. Had you seen this archive before?
Yes, it's that is the counter petition against the Annexation Manifesto, and the library has wonderful resources from all sorts of history on it, and it is, I think, one of the more remarkable documents you'll find on there. There's this moment where a bunch of leading business leaders, lawyers, politicians in Montreal in particular signed this Annexation Manifesto asking for the United States to take over the Canadian colonies, the province of Canada in particular, which is now Ontario and Quebec, and then this swift, overwhelming pushback, which was kind of centered on Toronto and what's now Ontario, of this big counter petition and a big movement that brought together a lot of sort of bitter political rivals, some of the biggest rivals in Canadian history, who were united in the idea that this could not be allowed to happen and that we needed to speak with a united voice against it.
We'll get to the pushback in a second. Dominique Marshall, let me get you in here to talk about the events that led to the creation of the Annexation Manifesto to begin with. What can you help us with on that?
There's a lot of disappointment with what had happened in 1848 when what is now Ontario and Quebec were united and responsible government was given to the Canadians. So that was after the rebellions of 36, 37, when lots of people wanted to leave England and they shipped over Lord Durham to reorganize Canada. So first legislature votes to actually exonerate, to some extent, the rebellious people and give them back some, there was some compensation on rebellion losses, and also a global, and also generally the Britain did not want any preferential treatment for Canadian goods. So that was all a move to give a bit more autonomy to Canadians, but also not to treat them with favor economically at a time when there was a global recession. So a funny thing happened. People who were former enemies, like the English merchants of Montreal, were disappointed at the economy of it all, but also at these bills that were kind of exonerating the rebellious people. But the people who had rebelled, some of them, the most extreme of them, were disappointed by the conservatism of that government and were quite happy to join the United States as well. So let's join the United States if we're merchants in order to bolster our economy. Let's join the United States if we are radical French-Canadian former rebellious people, because we like the idea of a real republic.
Well, let me follow up with Adam on that. Can you say that those that favored annexation with the United States, generally speaking, belong to one particular political party over another?
It was led definitely by the sort of Tory business leaders of Montreal. It was the Tories who'd been sort of historically the most loyal to the British, the most anti-American force in the Canadian colonies. But yeah, they were upset about responsible government. They were upset about the repeal of the Corn Laws. And
let me just jump in. When we say responsible government, you don't mean politicians who are just acting in a responsible way. This is actually a term.
Yeah, this is sort of still the political system we have today, and it had been a decades-long battle between Tories on one side, reformers on the other, that had come to a head. The reformers had won, they'd managed responsible government, and the Tories felt betrayed by the British for allowing it, and then betrayed again by tariff policy, getting rid of the Corn Laws that had kind of advantaged Canadians trading with Britain, which hit at the same time as an economic depression. Montreal was especially poorly hit, and these Tories who felt betrayed made this unlikely alliance, as Dominique was saying, with radical French-Canadian reformers to explore this idea of being annexed, including some of the biggest names in Montreal. John Redpath, the sugar tycoon, a couple of Molson brothers, John Abbott, who'd be a future prime minister, all signing on with this annexation manifesto.
John Abbott, the future prime minister, signed the annexation manifesto.
Yeah, he would later say it was a horrible, youthful mistake. But yeah, something he'd kind of have to live with and spend a lot of his life trying to sort of live down in a lot of ways that he had done it.
Dominique, was the instigation for this more from Canada or more from the U.S.?
Or from Canada. There were some people in the U.S. who were interested, but compared to former times, like during the American Revolution, where there were actually American people who wanted to take over Canada, compared to the War of 1812, when there was American people who wanted to take over Canada, and even compared to the Civil War after that, just before Confederation, this one was really more of a Canadian-moved thing. And the people who were, I suppose you'll talk about people who are against that later, but there you go. And on responsible government, Steve, really what it means is more autonomy locally to spend our own budget. That's what it means. And that's why it angered a lot of the elites who would have liked to have more control over the budget. They had fought against that anyway. Now they had lost to some more, as Alan said, reformist people. This is not complete like now. It's not as much autonomy as now, but more autonomy from the British colonial powers.
Now, because we have sophisticated polling today, we know that the vast, vast, vast majority of Canadians think this is should I use a gentle word here, or should they are opposed to the notion of joining the United States today. We didn't have sophisticated polling back then, so do we know how the population, Dominique, divided up back then on this annexation question?
So in most of these things, American Revolution, War of 1812, and then 1848, in general, that's what my teachers were telling me when I learned history. The population was not really interested. The general population, the farmers, the city dwellers, they become interested if they have to go and fight, or people who are on the border, but generally they're not. And in what is now Quebec and Ontario now, in the end, the people who were against and had political voice, like the people who signed the petition that you saw, won. And these people were partly, like I told, there was a part of the old radicals who rebelled in 36, like Louis-Joseph Papineau, who were for the annexation. Like, we want a republic. Let's, we don't want that wishy-washy system. We want a real republic. We'll join. But Louis Hippolyte Lafontaine, a former rebellious guy, was leading now the equivalent of the liberals in Quebec, and he had left these hyper Republican ideals and was more like George Brown, the person Alan will talk about. And it's these, amongst the political elite, these are the ones who won, and the other ones were marginal and remain marginal.
Adam, we've got to put this into context here, because we have to remember we're 20 years away still from being an independent country. And even when we were Canada, we weren't all that independent from the British Crown necessarily. So we can't really compare the anti-annexation fervor of today to back then, because we've got 156 years of history here that we're, that we obviously have under our belts. In which case, why did this fail?
Well, I think fear of American invasion, of annexation, was one of kind of the defining features of life, even in the Canadian colonies before Confederation. A lot of the people who are living here in the 1840s, the War of 1812 to them is still a relatively fresh memory, when Americans invaded thinking they were going to be welcomed as liberators. Thomas Jefferson famously said it would be a mere matter of marching, at least as far as Quebec City. But, some people now had memories of the Americans invading, of occupying a town like Toronto, looting, burning it. Some would definitely be thinking hard about the days of the American Revolution, too. There was this big sort of defining split between those 13 colonies that joined the Revolution and the 5 that are now Canadian provinces that stayed loyal. And for a lot of people, it was a defining feature of their culture and their life, was the fact that they weren't American, even from those early days. And they had memories of all these attempts over the years when Americans thought maybe Canada wanted to be part of the United States, and it had been answered in the negative every time. So even in the 1840s, even before Confederation, that was definitely a defining feature for a lot of people, many people who did care, and would continue to be. It would be one of the reasons we ended up with Confederation, was again a new wave of fears of invasion and annexation around the American Civil War that was a central part, even before we saw Canada as its own country, or as quite the national sense of pride that a lot of people have now. It was still kind of, the Americans were right there, and they thought a lot about them and whether they wanted to be them or not.
Well,
Many thought no.
Okay, Dominique, let me follow up with you on the issue of, if America had wanted to attack Canada, they had gone to war after all 3.5 decades earlier in the War of 1812. If they had wanted to, as Thomas Jefferson said, a mere matter of marching, come up and take us militarily, what was the status of our military at this time, and what kind of objection could we put up?
Well, when they tried in 1812, despite all our patriotism around the celebration of 1812, the British made sure that they wouldn't do it. Like, the loads and loads of British troops came here to defend their northern colonies. And when there were thoughts of that during the American Civil War, they were tempered, because the Americans were busy fighting south of the North, who was thinking maybe we could annex Canada to compensate for the loss of the South, fought south, and this was an idea that their military couldn't fight on 2 fronts. But my colleague here at Carleton, Frank Underhill, the public historian, said many years ago, somewhere on Parliament Hill, there should be a statue to the Americans, because it's thanks to their threat that we are what we are. And really, to explain Confederation in 1867, you need the fear of the Civil War, not only the fear of what was happening there, and maybe it could happen to us, but also, if we don't get our act together, we might be annexed. And very much like now, these fears, there's nothing like these fears to bring Canadians together.
Well, essentially, Jean Chrétien said the same thing at the Liberal Leadership Convention, right? He said we should put Donald Trump up for the Order of Canada, given the way that he has unified the country against him and his country. Okay, Adam, how about this? Were there any policies that were put in place after this annexation, talk of the time in the 1840s, after all that happened? Were there policies put in place to make sure that Canada's sovereignty, either as colonies or as a future country, would be safeguarded?
Well, the whole thing kind of fizzles out, in part because there is such overwhelming opposition to it. It's uniting these political rivals, reformers and Tories alike, people whose supporters had literally been beating each other bloody in the street, very much opposed, and fizzles out too because there's a good harvest that year. Things aren't as tough. There ends up being a new treaty with the United States, reciprocity, a bit of a mood toward free trade that helps alleviate some of those fears too. So it's more in the sort of decades to come that things...
That's in the 1900s that the reciprocity business...
Well, actually, there was a treaty in the years after, in the 1850s for a while, before the bigger debate in the early 1900s. And things have sort of shifted back and forth through our history. And that more free trade with the United States helped, in that moment, bring some Canadians to think annexation wasn't as important a thing. And then the big ones, really Confederation, just a couple of decades later. The idea that by uniting these, what back then were just a series of British Canadian colonies into the Dominion of Canada, that we'd be better able to resist American expansionism, and Manifest Destiny was one of the sort of factors leading into it. And then that 156 years, as you say, since, of generations of Canadians making that choice kind of over and over again and strengthening Canadian culture as we go.
Dominique, can I get you to comment on that? Because that is clearly a through line throughout the last 200 years of whatever you have called north of the 49th parallel, whether it was, Canada West, Canada East, Upper Canada, Lower Canada, Ontario, Quebec, Canada as a new nation in 1867. We have always wanted to resist becoming Americans. Where does that come from?
Well, there's a, kind of a general desire of people to own their own destiny. And for my patch of the place, French Canada, is very interesting. Like in just before the American Revolution, there was the Quebec Act. Like the British knew that they had to give more to French Canadians to avoid them being tempted to join the South. And the Quebec Act guaranteed some rights for religion and language to French Canadians, so they never became the 14th colony, but there was a clear fear that they would. And responsible government in 1848, again, giving stuff to them as a nation to have some measure of control on their own destiny, went a long way. And again, Confederation with their own province went a long way. So there's always this idea that there's got to give some autonomy to French Canadians to resist any temptation to weaken the unity of Canada. And during the free trade debate of Mulroney, which ended up with the Free Trade Agreement of 94, Quebecers backed up in a majority the Free Trade Agreement because they didn't see that their culture would be threatened. So there's always also that the problem of keeping French Canadians with English Canadians. And I also wanted to say that when Nixon raised tariffs in the early 70s, that led to Trudeau's new economic policy. So there's a lot of coming and going to keep unity going and to keep some measure of sovereignty for Quebecers and for Canada as a whole.
Yes. Now, while we have maintained our view on that, and Adam, I'll go to you on this, I mean, for 250 years or so, at various times, and we're going through one of them now, American leaders, some American leaders, have wanted to make us part of them. They have wanted to annex us. And for 250 years, we've been saying to them, go to hell. Why don't they get the message?
Well, for some, it goes back deep into American history and that idea of manifest destiny and the idea that the United States is bound someday to control the continent. That was the big driving force in the 1800s. And the idea of American exceptionalism, too. Certainly some have been quoted saying they wouldn't understand why you wouldn't want to be American. So I think some throughout American history have found Canadians a little baffling that we do want to forge our own path. And it seemed like a settled issue for a very long time. It was a very frequent topic of conversation through, from the American Revolution. One of the first things they did was head up and occupy Montreal, attack Quebec City, through the War of 1812, the Annexation Manifesto, all the stuff we've been talking about today, up to the early 1900s, but then it seemed settled. So this is a new generation going back to some of these very old ideas. They talk about Trump being inspired by the McKinley Tariff from 1890, which some Americans were also seizing on as a chance to annex us.
He says that was their best decade.
Yeah, I think a lot of people would disagree, Canadians included. But it's an old idea that very unexpectedly has reared its head again. So there are new reasons, I think, for it happening now, but one that, echoes through history for sure.
Well, let's compare those echoes. Dominique, how would you compare and contrast the way we responded, we soon-to-be Canadians, officially as a country, back in the 1840s to this Annexation Manifesto? Compare that to the way we are reacting today with this Never 51 view that I think the vast majority of Canadians hold.
Well, then we were very much stuck in European politics, right? Canada was still a British colony. The wars in Europe were, in many ways influencing our destiny. Alliances with the Indigenous people were very important. They still are to some extent. Loyalties to who from Indigenous people counts a great deal. We also have a lot of populations that move about, the loyalists that left the United States to remain loyal to the crown, and the culture, English Canadian culture, from then on, their churches and all that was different from the U.S. Now we have very different makeup, right? Our population is not as made up of European people. And in many ways, it's new. It's got to be seen. And at the moment, we don't have the similar outlook politically with the hyper-conservatism down the border and much more liberal views on refugees and all that here and on healthcare. And that also binds people in a way that did not exist now. But these are new circumstances. There's a place where the past cannot tell us everything, and we have to be very vigilant. And may I say, last Friday, Trump had an edict on to change American history. And, here in Canada, our views of how we do history are much more liberal. And I think these cultural values have a lot to do as well with probably what will be the next generation of defense of Canadian nationalism.
Well, Adam, let me give you the last 20 seconds on this. What's the lesson today we can take from the Annexation Manifesto of all those years ago?
I think it might be that there's always a surprising tiny number of Canadians who maybe do look to the South with envy. And some unlikely candidates have been open to the idea, but over and over again throughout our history, this is a province, a city that were founded to be homes for American refugees. Through our history, we have said no repeatedly and tried to set ourselves up as something of a relatively safe haven for Americans who don't want to be Americans anymore as well. And that's a repeating theme throughout our past.
Well, they say history doesn't repeat, but it sure does rhyme. And I guess this was one of the original rhymes. And I thank both of you for coming onto our program tonight and helping us out with this. Dominique Marshall, professor of Quebec and Canadian history at Carleton. Adam Bunch, you can read his stuff on the Toronto Time Traveler newsletter.
For having me.
Merci beaucoup tout le monde. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
In the fight against Donald Trump's tariff threats, one Ontario city mayor is making the case for why critical minerals could be Canada's trump card. He's Paul Lefebvre, the mayor of Greater Sudbury, and he joins us now to discuss how the nickel city and its partners across the province can help protect Canada's economic sovereignty. It's really nice to have you back, sir.
Thank you so much.
So what are you doing in town?
So I was invited by the Canadian Club to certainly deliver some remarks to talk about critical minerals and to certainly discuss how, certainly as in Canada, Ontario, for Sudbury, what can we do to make sure that our economic sovereignty, that we ensure our economic sovereignty. At the same time, we make sure that the jobs and the added value of our critical minerals is done here in Canada, certainly Ontario, and certainly as me as Mayor of Sudbury, in Greater Sudbury, and looking at the opportunities and discuss those opportunities with my friends in the rest of the GTA and the rest of Ontario.
Well, critical minerals are in everything from our cell phones to cars. We might not be aware of what's in those products.
That's right.
And Ontario is a province that's rich with critical minerals.
Very much so.
So what are they and how are they used?
Yeah, so, well, they're basically nickel, you have cobalt, lithium, right, and manganese are critical minerals, and there's a number of other critical minerals as copper as well. But certainly when we talk about electric vehicles and batteries, when we talk about semiconductors as well, when we're looking at storage of energy, and so those are all, and we look at the defense procurement, military equipment, nickel plays a large role. So that's kind of some of your critical minerals. There is a number of critical minerals that the province of Ontario and the government of Canada has said that they were critical minerals in our country, over 30 some. So now they're basically used, as I said, semiconductors, right, in energy storage, or in batteries, as well as in AI, and in defense applications. So it's around us everywhere, right? And so it's very important that now that the world is changing, and we are trying to make sure that we keep the opportunities here in our own province and in our own country, and just not trying to extract and send that out around the world, right? And then basically with the threats of our neighbors to the south, of trying to shore up on their own internal economy as much as they can, we need to make sure that we sort of look at the opportunities that we have to make sure that we keep that economic powerhouse that we are when it comes to natural resources, and critical minerals is one of them.
I mean, a year ago, I don't think any of us could have seen what's happening, the threats of annexation and the province and Canada pivoting to consider how we can take care of ourselves because we're being forced to do that.
So.
You wrote a column in Northern Ontario Business suggesting Sudbury can help fight Trump's trade war.
That's right.
How is your city positioned to do that?
Well, we're a very unique city in the sense that when it comes to critical minerals, we have 9 operating mines right now that extract nickel, cobalt, as well as copper, and a lot of the platinum metals. And so those are critical because in the U.S., we actually send about 60% of our nickel that we actually produce in Sudbury is sent to the U.S. And we actually provide most of the military equipment, nickel that they need in their alloys actually comes from Sudbury. We actually have another 10 mines that are under development in Greater Sudbury. That's very unique. You don't see that in a city. Just to give you a comparative, Sweden, which is a powerhouse in mining, has 10 operating mines. So we have 9 operating mines in Sudbury, plus another 10 that are under development. So as the world needs those critical minerals, and it needs that supply, we've been doing that. Plus, we have 2 smelters, 2 refineries, and a mill. Again, you don't see that type of mining complex anywhere in the world, and the talent that we have. We have the best hard rock miners in the world as well. And we do it safely, and we do it responsibly and sustainably. And we also have our Indigenous partners in our area that are supportive, right? So it took a while to get there, but certainly we are trying to make sure that we move forward in the right way, that they're engaged, and they have economic opportunities as well. So there's lots that were very unique in Greater Sudbury, and that's why there's value proposition to make sure that we increase the supply and we do more advanced processing, so ensure that we do the advanced manufacturing in Canada and Ontario, and certainly in our area as much as we can. So as we want to keep the jobs in Canada, these are things that certainly as governments, municipally, provincially, federally, we need to be focused on to make sure that we keep that resource here as long as we can before we export it around the world.
Do you have knowledge of plans to build processing facilities in Sudbury?
Well, that's one of the things that we'd like to see. We have 2 smelters and 2 refineries and a mill. But when we look at the electric battery vehicles, and there's been big investments by the province and by the federal government here in the GTA, and certainly across the Southern Ontario, And we always say, well, the whole supply chain is going to come from Ontario because we're going to get the supply from the north when it reaches the minerals, but then it needs to be provided into a form called a pre-cathode anode material, PCAMs. And we don't have one of those yet. There's only one in Canada that's being built, and it's near Montreal. What's unique about it is that it's the first one in Canada between GM, POSCO, which is a Korean manufacturer, and Vale. So the nickel that is being provided to Quebec is actually coming mainly from Sudbury. and you need sulfuric acid as well, and that's coming from Sudbury as well, which is great. Right? The fact that they're doing a PCAM plant and a CAM plant in Quebec, that's what the government wanted. But now in Ontario, there's been investments in the lithium plant in Thunder Bay, which is great news, a cobalt plant in Cobalt, Ontario, and now we need to have a nickel sulfate refinery created in Ontario to make sure we take the nickel, we create it into that powder that goes into the PCAM. It's very complex, but we have an opportunity in Ontario to create all that supply chain, that independent supply chain when it comes to battery electric vehicles.
What does your city stand to gain?
Jobs, right? And economic. At the end of the day, jobs is one and foremost. But you know what? We've been seeing our minerals being extracted, right, and processed and then shipped out. Before, because our world has changed. Before it was mainly stainless steel, right? The application for nickel was mainly stainless steel, but that world has completely changed in the last decade. So we're seeing an opportunity. So right now we're shipping our nickel out, which is great, but there's more supply in the Sudbury Basin than ever. As much as we've been mining for 100 years, there's at least another 100 years of mining in our area. That's what all the geologists are saying. So we're just saying that this is a great opportunity for our province, certainly for our community, as well as for our country to have that economic sovereignty, because critical minerals is key. And when you look at the geopolitical situation, right now is China's leading the way by far. But they've been doing this for decades now. They've had their industrial strategy lined up. The U.S. is really late to the game. That's one of the things that the President Trump is trying to say, well, that's why he wants to get Greenland. Ukraine. And now he's threatening us to become the 51st state because he sees that race and they're so far behind. So we're disappointed, obviously, as Canadians, because we're saying, well, we want to be partners. You don't come here and just try to think you're going to be able to invade us. We don't work that way. We are trading partners. We are reliable trading partners. And for us as a country, I think we need to do more to shore up what we have here, create the jobs here and create the economic benefits in our communities, with Indigenous partners as well, and in our province and in our great country.
To fight for our sovereignty.
Exactly.
A part of Ontario that we're hearing a lot about lately in the news is the Ring of Fire.
Yeah.
And for those who may not be familiar with it, it's located approximately 500 kilometers northeast of Thunder Bay. So if you're flying from Toronto, a plane to Thunder Bay and another plane, a smaller plane.
It's really far.
It's far, and it covers about 5,000 square kilometers.
Right.
Can you explain to us why this area is so valuable?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of the mineral deposits there that we don't even know really the value of it because it is massive. There's obviously nickel and there's copper in there and there's some base metals as well as chromite. But right now the price of chromite is very low, so there's no real business case to go and extract the chromite, whereas nickel and copper, we believe is a good starting point. So that it was discovered almost 2 decades ago now, and it's taken a time because it's so remote. We need to build a road there, and you're in very challenging environmental situation. A lot of water, a lot of muskeg, so a very, very swampy area, so very hard to get to. And plus, to do it properly, you need to engage with the First Nations, right? And there is a lot of competing jurisdictional claims to the area as well. You have Webequie, you have Martin Falls, you have Ubimatong, you have Nishigandiga. That's 4 communities. And then there's a number of communities even further than that certainly want to play a role there. So the province has said they want to move it forward, right? And so there's communities there that you know, their situations are very challenging on the social side. So they want to see commitment by everybody to certainly help them surmount that. So it's not easy. It's a complex one from where it is and how to extract it, and then how you're going to get the ore out, right? So there's right now Martin Falls, I believe, is doing the design for a road in the area. It's a long road, but that will open up those communities. And they're not used to that, right? They've been very secluded. They've been on their own. So there's a lot of work to be done to assist them and to work with them. And certainly that it's led by them. It has to be led by them, or else, you know, then you don't have the social license to go in there. That's very unique about Sudbury. When you talk about a Ring of Fire, and as my Indigenous communities are talking to those Indigenous communities, they're kind of relaying the message of what we learned here. It hasn't always been perfect in Sudbury for Indigenous communities, right? Where we were 50 years ago, where we are today, where we are going in another 50 years, there's about more conversations than we've ever had. That's what it has to be on every deposit in our province as well.
So consultation with Indigenous communities is important to you.
100%.
I'm going to talk about the province in just a second, but we are in the middle of a federal election, and federal Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre made an announcement on March 19th in Sudbury and said that within 6 months, if he were to become Prime Minister, he would greenlight all federal permits for the Ring of Fire, and he'll commit $1 billion to build new roads to access it. Sudbury isn't directly in the Ring of Fire.
No.
Why is this issue important to you?
Well, certainly for us, at the end of the day, where is that nickel going to be refined, right? Smelted. It has to be Sudbury. There is no nickel refinery or smelter that can do that but Sudbury right now. So certainly as that will be extracted, they're going to have to ship that somewhere else. So it's important for us. That being said, we want all deposits because at the end of the day, mining, again, once a community has mining, they don't want to lose it. But once they don't, with communities that don't have mining, sometimes they don't want to have it because of the uncertainty, right? They don't know, and
What uncertainty?
Well, because the environmental uncertainties, right? Are we going to get the benefits? Or are they going to leave us with this environmental catastrophe, right? And there's the image sometimes of past mining project is not very, very positive. Even though, as I come back to Sudbury, obviously we have really taken our environment where we were a number of years ago, which are a devastated landscape. We planted 10 million trees. We reduced our SO2 emissions by 98%, so we have clean air in our community. Before there was a lot of pollution in the air. And our lakes, we have 330 lakes in Sudbury, and all of which now all have marine life, right? But that wasn't always the case. So we've learned a lot. Now we can share a lot with the world, and certainly I share a lot with Northern Ontario as well. So that's why that license that I like to call about being able to move these projects forward, they have to be done in the right way. So we send a benefit, but certainly it has to be done in the right way.
I imagine too, like once you do get all of those approvals in place, that a mine isn't just built overnight.
Oh, no.
I read it's like 17. It can take to 17 years.
Well, that's with the permitting, right? The permitting, and then certainly to build a mine, you're looking at a number of years as well, because by the time they do they determine where they want to do what we call the shaft, right, in the middle of the ore body or beside the ore body, so that they can get to it. It's very complex, a lot of expertise, and that it's interesting because Sudbury, the people from Sudbury, and a lot of expertise comes from Sudbury because we export that around the world. They live in Sudbury because they've learned in Sudbury, but then we export that around the world.
So how can Sudbury benefit from the development of the Ring of Fire?
Well, like I said, right, it's basically the nickel would come to Sudbury and be processed there. And now when we talk about that advanced processing and that PCAM plant I talked to you about, that could be one of the sources of it as well. It's interesting because I think some of my friends in the northwest of the province will say, well, how can you talk about that because that's our area? Well, my response to that is this. I don't think you want a smelter in your backyard with the tailings and the slag that comes with that. We're used to that. That's what we do in Sudbury, right? We know how to deal with it. We have confidence in the people that minimize the exposure to the slag and the tailings in our area. We have hundreds of thousands of tons of it. And that's why we're saying we can do more because of the knowledge that we've created, because of the environment that we've created, and that the fact that we know how to do this. And that's very unique around the world.
Well, with that being said, this isn't a new conversation. Parties on both sides and on both levels haven't been able to get this done for a very long time. Why now?
Well, I think there's always been talk about it, right? But it's a challenge. But I think now we need more of those critical minerals than ever. We need to, as we're competing around the world, and people have a choice to make, right, as to where they're going to source their critical minerals. Where we have the endowments here in Ontario and certainly in Canada as well. And I would say that if it's not us, it's China. If it's not China, Russia has some as well. So you have countries like Canada and Australia that have these endowments, and certainly versus China and Russia. So I think if we want to have that independence, if we want to make sure that we're not beholden to other countries, when it comes to our manufacturing sector, and we need to make sure that we develop as much as we can that we have in our own country.
You talked about how we need to consult Indigenous communities in this process. During Premier Doug Ford's campaign trail, he said consulting with Indigenous communities hundreds of kilometers away is a, quote, ridiculous ask. What types of conversations are you having with Indigenous communities around Greater Sudbury?
Oh, I have them all the time. Actually, it was interesting. We just had the big mining conference here in Toronto a few weeks ago, and actually we were on a panel, myself, my two Indigenous chiefs, Chief Rock from Guanapate and Chief Nushtai from Tikmashing, with Valley. talking about certainly how we're doing it in Sudbury. It's not perfect. It's not. And where we were 50 years ago was not perfect at all. Like, it was just big challenges. But it's about having conversations, sitting down together, making sure that there's opportunities, because this needs to benefit everybody, just not the mining company. It needs to benefit the community as well, and the First Nations as well. That's the approach that we've taken. That's why we're very unique. Is we're very successful. And I'm not saying that in the future there won't be challenges again, but that's why these conversations, sitting down together, ensuring that we're at the table together, is key to make sure that. You know what? People have confidence in the project and in the process that we're following.
Have you spoken with federal government and the province on easing regulations around mining?
Yeah, we always talk about that. It's more, I think right now, it's more having one process instead of 2 or 3 processes. Right now, there's a review there's an environmental review by the province and an environmental review by the feds as well. Saying, is there a way that government can work together to have one review instead of 2? Because at the end of the day, we need to get supply in our country of our critical minerals. We need to process it as fast as we can in our country as well, and then we need to develop the manufacturing capacity. But if we're not getting the processing, the permitting process completed quickly, that can take decades. So is there a way to streamline that, have confidence in the process, but make it quicker and more resilient?
Do you worry, because we were talking about how fast the news is moving from the U.S., but do you worry in this moment when we are trying to figure out how to look inward and to take care of ourselves, that maybe by easing certain regulations it might cause problems down the road? Well,
that's always a concern, but I think we're not saying stop doing the review, right? We're saying let's do one review instead of 2 reviews, right? And I think it comes up to the same to the same level, but at the same time, we have to have the confidence in the system. And I think in Canada, we have one of the best, processes, and certainly the reviews that we do, we have the best confidence in the world because of where we are a world-class mining country. But things are so slow, and we need to do it quicker. But we need to make sure that we have confidence in the way that we do it as well.
In our last minute, as mayor of one of Ontario's largest cities, what do you want from both levels of government? Well, certainly to take, when we look at critical minerals, and Sudbury is at the forefront of that. Let's look at opportunities to develop more of that supply and that processing, so that we can help Canada manufacture more in Canada. Critical minerals are at the forefront of that. They're actually one of the bedrocks of that type of economy. And we want to make sure that we're at the table to have those conversations. Thank you so much for making the time to speak with us. I really appreciate it. And safe travels home. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Here's the premise of a new play at CanStage called Playing Shylock. An actor, starring in Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice, finds out during the intermission that the play has been cancelled. From there, the actor playing Shylock talks to his audience about how furious he is with the decision and takes us on a journey, asking some tough questions about artistic courage, Jewish identity, and acting itself. The actor in this one-man tour de force is the great Saul Rubinek, and he joins us now for more. It is a delight to meet you.
Hi, nice to meet you too.
Absolute pleasure.
Thank you.
Can you unlayer a little bit of Shylock for us as to why he fascinates you so much?
Well, first of all, this is a fascinating piece. It is probably the first time in English literary history, in the history of English literature altogether, maybe the history of literature, that a Jewish character is presented as a three-dimensional character, even though he's a villain. He's got a decent motive. You have to remember that in England, when this was written in 1595, and I dispute that the man from Stratford wrote this in the play, but that's also my...
You don't think Shakespeare wrote this?
But it's also my opinion, and I'm not alone. I mean, there are many, many people who doubt that the man from Stratford wrote much other than 5 bad signatures and a few letters about debts. But that's only important. We'll get back to that. Why is that important? Who gives a shit about who wrote it if you enjoy it? Like, do you care that Beethoven, Life of Beethoven, do you care that Beethoven wrote the Ninth Symphony, or just want to enjoy it? That's an interesting question. But what was going on then, there had been no Jews in England for 300 years. So if a play is called anti-Semitic, what is anti-Semitism if there are no Jews on the streets to attack, or in schools to attack, or synagogues to attack? What is anti-Semitism? Well, anti-Semitism then was a cultural thing. It was about Christ killers. It was about the Jews who were spawn of the devil. They were presented on stage as puppets with horns, when maybe real Jews had cloven feet. Maybe real Jews actually did have horns. Maybe anyway, they weren't seen. On stage, they were seen as spawn of the devil. And they were not three-dimensional people. In fact, the big hit of the Hamilton of its age, written 5 years earlier by Christopher Marlowe, was The Jew of Malta. Massive hit, maybe a block away from the Globe Theatre. And The Jew of Malta, the guy is just evil incarnate. So here is a character, and your audience may not be aware of this, but the Merchant of Venice is not the Jewish character. That's an Italian Christian called Antonio. The Merchant of Venice, that's the title role.
Shylock's the moneylender.
He's a moneylender. It's 5 scenes. That's it, 5 scenes.
Pretty memorable.
Well, memorable enough that it made the careers of actors over 400 years of reputations of actors.
Right.
Why is a good question. Why? What is it about this character? Well, partly you have to see the play to see it, to understand a little bit about why. Playing Shylock gets into it. You know, and if you've got a great actor playing in Merchant of Venice, then you'd see it too. But Merchant of Venice is very rarely played these days with a Jewish actor as Shylock, which is part of the premise of this play.
I was going to get into that later, but since you raised it, why don't we get into that right now? We are at a time in the life of our country where it is no longer acceptable for a non-Asian to play an Asian character, for a non-Indigenous person to play an Indigenous person in a play. And yet,
there's a book written called Jews Don't Count.
Well, okay, maybe that's where we want to go with this. For some reason, you don't need to be Jewish to play Shylock. What do you think about that?
Well, obviously, I think a great deal about it, since that's part of the premise of the play. Look, there's a great line to play where I say, you know, my manager calls me. I say in the play, my manager called me up when I was not getting a lot of character. He said, Saul, I'm sorry, you know, they're not looking to cast old white guys in character roles these days. What are you talking about? I'm not white, I'm Jewish. My manager says, yeah. So the guys marching down the street chanting, Jews will not replace us, they don't think you're white, but they don't cast movies. The people who cast movies, they think you're white. And we have been maybe white for a sliver in history, but we are other, and we always have been other since probably the fall of the Temple of Solomon. And I don't really mind at all when non-Jews play Jewish roles. There is, yes, I understand why it is offensive to put blackface on and for non-Asians to play Asians. I understand that can be really offensive, especially since so many other cultures have been denied the amount of work in our culture as white people have, including Jews. So I understand that. However, I believe, yes, as long as that's said, that I believe that can be truly offensive, and that is a cultural appropriation under those circumstances. That said, I think acting, to a great extent, acting is appropriation.
You're pretending to be somebody you're not.
Well,
that's the whole thing.
Well, what is the whole thing? Being somebody that you're not is probably the only way an actor can show their common humanity with others. So you're somebody you're not in real life. Then you have to walk in their shoes. And that is the beauty of writing, art, everything. So there is a dividing line, and it may be gray. And although it's proper to object to when it's onerous and racist, it is also difficult subject.
Here's another difficult subject I'd like you to chew on, and that is whether this play has more resonance for you after the events of October 7th.
You know, one of the things I really avoid doing as an actor is to be any kind of spokesman for any kind of political opinion. I don't feel that I have the expertise, the background, the knowledge, and the education to be able to speak to that in a public forum. What I can do is, the words Gaza and Israel are nowhere in this play. And if they were, I probably wouldn't have done it. I'm not trying to, none of us.
The word Palestinian is in the play.
The word Palestinian is in the play appropriately, as one of the people who are okay to play Shylock these days. I say Shylock is played very often. Shylock is black, Shylock is indigenous, Shylock is Palestinian.
As a woman?
As a woman, yeah, that we talk about all that. But as a Jew, it's offensive to many people, and that's part of the story. So it wasn't, first of all, we started work on this before October 7th, but certainly it has to do with pre-Holocaust and post-Holocaust and Holocaust. It has to do with the history of the Jewish people, and that Shylock has been a lightning rod for anti-Semitism and debate since it was first on in 1595, before there were even Jews in England. So that is fascinating, because once you create a three-dimensional Jewish character, you can imagine this. Imagine that you have an audience in the 16th century. What were they used to? They were used to a Jew on stage that had a red wig. It was called a Judas wig, okay, because Judas was supposed to have had red hair. So they had red wigs. They had noses that came down and touched their chins. And they were comedy characters. They were played by the low clowns in the company, not by the great actors. And when they went on stage, the audiences threw oyster shells and figs. That's what they threw in those days. And they booed them and catcalled them and everything else. Now imagine you're a 16th century audience that's used to that. And you get this character that comes on stage, and he was dressed like that. There is record that Richard Burbage, not the clown actor in the company, the guy who owned the theater, 30-year-old Richard Burbage, owner of the Globe Theater, and who had just played Richard III. He was the star actor, not playing the central character of the Merchant of Venice, but playing a 5-scene role. Why? Probably because of this, what I'm about to tell you, because the audiences would have had their hands cocked, ready to throw figs, and they would have heard him go, what is his reason? What is his reason for treating me the way I am being treated? Because I am a Jew. Hath not a Jew eyes, hath not a Jew hands, hath not a Jew organs, dimensions, senses, feelings, passions, hurt by the same weapons, fed by the same foods. And you can imagine that they were stopped dead in their tracks. That instant can't be recreated unless we recast the audience into a 16th century audience. Certainly post-Holocaust, all Shylocks are played sympathetically. But even if it would have been played unsympathetically by actors in the 17th century, 18th century, certainly pre-Holocaust in England, you can't get away from that speech that humanizes that Jewish character to an audience where there were no Jews in the audience, and audiences that were anti-Semitic as easily as being a Torontonian and a Blue Jays fan. It was in mother's milk. So that's an extraordinary thing in the history of portraying Jews on stage. It is the most famous Jewish character in history and has brought with it. Look, Goebbels decided that that was the most often produced Shakespeare play in Nazi Germany. They just cut out the speeches that humanize him. They just make him a bad guy. And so, of course, Jewish people all the time, so you're not going to put Merchant of Venice on. Certainly you're not going to put please don't do that, not today. Rising anti-Semitism. There's a great line in the play that says, when was that time when anti-Semitism wasn't rising? Before or after Moses crossed the Red Sea? When was that?
I want to finish on something which I hope you won't think is too macabre. How old was your father when he died?
Well, it's a good question. He was my age, I thought, until I found his birth certificate and found out he lied about his age.
Because you say in the play
76.
He was 76,
yeah.
And you today are 76.
Yes, but it turns out that he was actually 6 years older than he said.
Ah, okay.
So he was 82.
So this last line of questioning then makes no sense whatsoever.
Go for it.
Because the question was going to be, how does that sit with you, being the age at which your father died?
It sits with me exactly as it felt on the stage, because at the moment I'm doing it on stage, it feels true. And it's an extraordinary moment for me on stage, but you have to see the play in a way to understand why. Yeah. Because in a way, the character is doing Shylock in a way for his father, who was an actor in Yiddish theater, which is also true about my father. He was an actor in Yiddish theater in Poland pre-Holocaust. So it has to do with it isn't so much the exact number. It has to do with an actor in the last act of his life denied the opportunity to play the role of his lifetime. For that actor named Saul, who's always wanted to play Shylock, which isn't really true about this actor named Saul. But that actor named Saul really had his dream role taken out from under him. And so he's looking at his mortality and looking at his father's mortality. And his father never got to play it. And he only got to play it for so long before it was yanked. And so it has, the feeling that you're getting there has to do with what is possible for an artist to do when offending people. Is that, can you be an actor if only you can do things that don't offend people? Can you be an artist of any kind, a writer, a musician? I mean, if that's all we're allowed to do, then what are we there for? Is the whole feeling of the role and the character. Probably the most important line in the play for me is when my father's father, and this is a true story, my father's father, was my story my father told me because I couldn't hear it from my Zeta, from my grandfather, because he died in a concentration camp. But my father said, you know, his father was horrified when my father cut off his payas, his side curls, his Orthodox Jewish side curls, and became an actor. And my father had to explain why this sin, this indecency, this shanda, this shameful act that my grandfather said was so far away from God, why he was doing it. He was the oldest. I mean, all the other kids looked up to him. Why? Why would he do it? And my father says, probably the best definition for art that I'd ever heard, which was, if theater is good, then the audience sees themselves on the stage and they don't feel so alone. And my grandfather said, maybe it's not so far away from God after all. And to me, that the essence of the piece is in that exchange.
I am happy to say that people need to go see Playing Shylock, because you are phenomenal in it, as you have been over the last 20 plus minutes here for this conversation.
Thank you.
It's been a delight to get to know you, both on stage and here in our studio.
Thank you, thank you.
So thank you very much, Saul Rubinek.
Thank you.
And that is the agenda for Monday, March 31st, 2025. Just a reminder that Saul Rubinek play, Playing Shylock, will be back at the CAA Theatre in Toronto this week. Not to be missed. Now, should Canada's broadcast regulator ban Fox News? We'll explore that rather intriguing question tomorrow. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.